Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome, Minister Conroy. We know we're on a very tight timing leash today, 20 minutes to traverse a fair bit of ground, but I know you've been made familiar with the report. There have been some very interesting themes that have emerged from it, and where I'd like to just start a conversation with you is about one of the striking elements, and that is the perception of security as being more than defence. And I think the community consultations have reinforced that people are not indifferent to security, but they define it in their own way. And often that's a very personal, very localised sense of challenge, an awareness of threat and unease, but not necessarily panic, as Rory told us this morning. And it strikes me, looking at your particular portfolios, defence industry, defence capability delivery, Pacific Island affairs, you sit in the National Security Committee of Cabinet. And to me, that is a very eloquent illustration of the breadth of what constitutes security. And I'd be interested in how you'd like to address that perception, bearing in mind that one of the other things we've heard about is preparedness. And there's a tendency to think of preparedness purely in military terms, but there's a bigger whole of nation and whole of society dimension to that. So from the vantage point of a member of the National Security Committee with a traverse across our region, as well as responsibility for building our economic and productive capacity in the defence arena, where do you see the debate positioned now, and how would you like to see security addressed in the public domain?
Yeah, thanks for the question and thanks for having me today. I would say that government is catching up to where the people have been, and the survey has shown how holistic the general public opinion is, and we are catching up, and we've caught up over the last 4 years. So I've been a member of the National Security Committee of Cabinet from the first day of the Albanese government in 2022. I'm only the second Defence Industry Minister after Christopher Pyne to have that status, and the first Pacific Minister to have that. And that's symptomatic of our approach of using every tool of statecraft to advance our security, and most particularly in the Pacific. So we can talk about that later, using not just conventional security or development policy or defence cooperation, but every tool of statecraft. But then secondly, seeing industry policy as good security policy, and our Future Made in Australia agenda reflects the views of the Australian public about what they want to see in this country. And so me being on NSC, being really focused on mobilisation and preparedness is critical to that, me working with Tim Ayres as the industry minister. And it resonates with the public. I'll tell you, one of the most popular defence industry announcements I've made over the last 4 years is about building an Australian missile manufacturing industry. And when I was door knocking ahead of the last election, whether I was door knocking in the most affluent parts of my electorate or the lowest SES, I've got the poorest postcode in all of New South Wales. The thing that people raised with me unprompted was the fact that we'd be building a missile factory near RAF Williamtown. So people understand the need for more resilience, more sovereignty, because they see that as critical to their security. So it's an agenda that even before the current Iran conflict resonates out there.
That's a very, I think, important illustration, and it brings me also to, I think, one of the failures in the way in which the narrative has been cast to date around nuclear-powered submarines. There's a tendency to perceive that as just a defence capability, whereas it is, in its breadth and its scale, something that really ought to be a whole of economy, a whole of nation uplift exercise. Are we getting that message properly calibrated in terms of selling the argument around what this is beyond just a very sophisticated, complex piece of military capability? It brings industrial policy, it brings manufacturing, vocational and tertiary education and training, and of course the vast investment in infrastructure. What would be the way in which we make that thing more relevant to the population, given the very local and specific perceptions people have of security don't always put military threat front and centre?
Well, we talk about it as the greatest industrial undertaking this country's ever attempted. And we do that for a couple of reasons. One, so people understand the scale of the challenge. and the scale of the capability that we're acquiring. But secondly, the opportunities. Just as the Collins class build modernised Aussie manufacturing in the 1990s, this will do that, but on steroids. If you think about the mobilisation required, we'll be doing the most advanced manufacturing ever undertaken in the world, and that will uplift a huge range of Australian manufacturers to technical base. That's why we're funding 4,000 additional university places in STEM. A lot of those people won't go into industries related to AUKUS, but we do recognise that we need to uplift STEM within our learning outcomes to be part of this. So we see that as critical, but AUKUS is the tip of the spear as far as I'm concerned. I see the Australian defence industry as replacing the Australian automotive industry as the key driver of not just advanced manufacturing, but research in this country. At its peak, the Australian automotive sector was doing 25% of the R&D in the manufacturing, which obviously was overrepresented in terms of the national business R&D. It was a key enabler. It spun out production technologies like lean. It drove a lot of the skills training that then overflowed to other industries. So I see the defence industry as replacing that, and not just in states like SA, but even on the East Coast. And that growing, the employment in the industry grew by 15% in the last 2 years. We're well north of 100,000 doing the most advanced technical work in the country, if not the world. So for me, as I keep coming back to, industry policy is good security policy, but security policy is also good industry policy. And that's the interlink that a lot of Australians understand in their gut, and we need to make sure that's articulated in formal policy making.
And that also highlights something that I think is not often perceived. And when I reflect on conversations I would have in my diplomatic career with people abroad, we are a nation of 27 million people, overwhelmingly concentrated on the East Coast, half the population in 3 major cities. And I was talking earlier today with a representative from one of the state and territory jurisdictions, and there was an interesting perception articulated there about that notion of a binary view of security. Security is something where decisions are taken in Canberra or in the major centres, remote from perhaps some of the more proximate considerations. In a federalist structure, how can we better position ourselves to drive this whole of nation embrace? Because what you were talking about there, I think, is a very pertinent point about the emphasis on the manufacturing capacities of the East and South Australia and Southwest Western Australia. How is security from this perspective, from industrial growth and development, going to be made more pertinent and relevant to people in Darwin or in Alice Springs or in other more remote parts of the country?
Well, I think a critical factor is getting buy-in from both local communities and state and territory administrations. The gold standard for me, and it's not just because I've had a thumping landslide, is the Malinasca state government in South Australia. Like, we work seamlessly with them on not just skills and training and infrastructure, but skills and training is a great example. They took to the previous election technical high schools. We're now seeing graduates from their technical high schools going into the defence industry, going into the Hunter shipyard at BAE in Port Osborne, going into building our Hunter-class frigates. So that joining up is critical. It's critical to social licence. It's critical to getting these resources, because ultimately we do need a national mobilisation. The National Defence Strategy in 24 was notable for many reasons, but the title in itself, National Defence, recognising that this cannot just be left to the Department of Defence or Defence ministers to deliver security for this country. It requires efforts at all levels of government. The work that Stephen Kennedy has done in Prime Minister and Cabinet, centering security within our national architecture, is another great example of that work, bringing it back into the centre so that it's not just left to isolated pockets to deliver this.
And that national narrative, I think, also extends beyond the domestic focus. So again, looking at your blend of portfolio responsibilities and the continuity in the concept of shape, deter, respond, where the emphasis is being placed very much on deterrence, but shaping the region and the signalling that we emit to our allies and adversaries alike is an important component of this. And could you reflect a little bit on how you can draw these sorts of imperatives and drivers you've been talking about into how we interact with our region, particularly in the Pacific, but perhaps more broadly as well?
It starts with two things: longevity and unity of purpose. By the end of this term, subject to obviously the decisions of the Prime Minister, Richard Marles will be the longest serving Defence Minister since Jim Killen. I'll be the longest running Defence Industry or Defence Supply Minister since 1950. That longevity really matters because that means you get strong coherence of policy making, you've got strong accountability with our public service. Like, it's no secret that under the last government, goldfish lasted longer than coalition defence ministers. And that meant, and I don't say that glibly, it's very hard to affect change if the leadership is changing all the time. We're also blessed with the fact that we've got our most senior sort of triumvirate of Prime Minister, Defence Minister and Foreign Minister in living memory. I think you'd have to go back to maybe World War II to have those three people at such a senior level of a government also united in their approach. So that longevity and unity really matters. The second one is personal relationships. In the Pacific, but all international diplomacy, personal relationships really matter. We turn up, we listen and act on the priorities of our partners and use every tool of statecraft to deliver that. And that means having really strong personal relationships. I've been to the Pacific 34 times, 34 trips, including 10 trips to PNG since we were elected. That means that we can do innovative arrangements like the PNG Rugby League deal that delivers security for our region. The Prime Minister Albanese spending 3 days walking the Kokoda track with Prime Minister Marape, sleeping in tents next to each other. Those things affect how you relate to the region and the world, and that's how you deliver a much broader, less transactional approach to security.
And that, again, is another very important theme: continuity, longevity and alignment. A former Defence Minister, whom I won't name, said to me once, I think it was a quip, but there's a grain of truth in it: the good thing about being Minister for Defence is you get to implement and apologise for the decisions of your predecessors. And there is something here that I think is lost often in the public debate, as we call it, that defence procurement is complex. It outlasts any single legislature. And one of the risks we have, I think, is of self-deterrence. We tell ourselves we can't do things, they're too complex, too expensive, beyond us. We deny ourselves the agency. But part of that, and I think it comes through in the report as well, is around what I think some of the findings have suggested is a politicisation of the narrative around defence and national security. There is a coherence, I think, across decades of investment in capability that is often, in the views of respondents to the report, compromised by the day-to-day tacticking and politicking around who is a safer custodian of security. Is there more we should or could be doing to reset that narrative and encourage people that there is a coherence, there is a continuity, and there is a sustained commitment for national security and national defence?
Well, there are opportunities, and we are seeing some green shoots. The establishment of the Parliamentary Joint Defence Committee, that will be akin to the Joint Intelligence Committee, I think is a really good opportunity. Like, if you think about parliamentary support for the Intelligence Committee through the PJCIS, with the occasional bump, that's been bipartisan and I think coherent for many decades. And I'd like to see the Defence Committee doing similar work. The shift to a biannual planning cycle, like I said to my opponents before the 25 election, no matter what happens, please keep that sort of biannual planning cycle where you have a 2-yearly national defence strategy with an IIP update through that, rather than ad hoc white papers, because that gives you a continuity approach that's much more systematic. So I think there are opportunities there. But look, politicians are going to be politicians. There's always going to be an element of political game playing. It's really about how we set the boundaries around that and how society says to the political actors, we're not going to copy you playing politics with these issues. They're too important. And I do see that on the ground. Like we saw in the 22 election, an attempt by certain people to sort of weaponise the trade blockages and the challenges that we had with China, including some incredible language being used against potential senior leaders of political parties. and the Australian public rejected that. So, and I think there's a lesson there for most politicians.
And that's a good optimistic note on which to end, because unfortunately time is tight today. But it's an opportunity as well to put in a plug shamelessly for the National Security College's National Security Program 2026, directed at parliamentarians. And there was a very, very heartening refrain that emerged from the opening briefing in which I was involved a month or so ago. 30-odd members of parliament, senators, members, some first-termers, and one of the recurrent messages from them was a desire to become better informed about these complex issues in order to have a better, more grounded, more accessible conversation with constituents. And I think that is a body of work that requires the commitment of everybody in this room, because it goes to local, it goes to state, it goes to federal, and it's about building that awareness and understanding and shaping that in constructive ways that align with the long-term security interests of our nation. And you have a unique position and opportunity to shape and influence that. And we thank you for the work that you've been doing. And we thank you for being part of this discussion here today. So please join me in thanking Minister Pat Conroy.
Thank you.